In the charming town of Silverbell, an elderly woman named Mrs. Lillian owned a small but beloved bakery. Everyone in town knew her, and for years, her cakes had been famous across Silverbell. Her bakery was always filled with the warm, inviting aroma of freshly baked cakes and cookies. People adored her creations because they weren't just desserts. They were little pieces of joy, made with love. Every morning, before the sun even rose, Mrs. Lillian would wake up, tie her apron, and begin her work. She crafted all kinds of cakes, chocolate, vanilla, fruit. But her most special creation was the Moonlight Delight cake. This cake was her secret recipe, and no one knew exactly how she made it. People traveled from all over the town just to taste it. The bakery was always filled with customers. Some came for birthday cakes, some for celebrations, and others simply for a slice to enjoy with their tea. Mrs. Lillian knew all her customers by name, and she always gave free cookies to the children who visited. One day, a young boy named Leo stepped into the bakery. He had heard stories about the famous Moonlight Delight cake and longed to try it. Though he didn't have much money, he had saved up for a whole week just for a small piece. Standing in line, he waited patiently for his turn. When he finally reached the counter, he looked up at Mrs. Lillian and said, "I would love a piece of the Moonlight Delight cake, please." Mrs. Lillian smiled warmly. "Of course, young man," she said, carefully cutting a small piece and wrapping it neatly. "This will be just enough for you to enjoy." Leo handed over his savings and left the bakery, his face glowing with excitement. The moment he took a bite, his eyes widened in wonder. The cake was soft, sweet, and melted in his mouth like a cloud. It was unlike anything he had ever tasted. The next day, Leo returned, not to buy a cake, but with a different request. "Mrs. Lillian, your cake was amazing. I want to learn how to bake like you. Will you teach me?" Mrs. Lillian looked at him thoughtfully. "Baking is not just about the recipe, boy. It's about baking with your heart. If you want to learn, you have to promise me one thing." Leo asked, "What is it?" "You must promise to always bake with love. That's the real secret to making delicious cakes." Leo promised, and Mrs. Lillian agreed to teach him. The next morning, Leo arrived at the bakery before sunrise. Mrs. Lillian gave him an apron and showed him how to measure flour, sugar, and butter. She taught him how to mix the ingredients slowly and carefully. She explained the importance of patience in baking. 4 weeks. Leo came to the bakery every morning, practicing alongside Mrs. Lillian. Slowly he became better and better. One day, after many lessons, Leo baked his first Moonlight Delight cake. Mrs. Lillian tasted it and smiled. "You did it, Leo," she said. "Your cake is perfect." Leo was overjoyed. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Lillian. I will never forget what you have taught me." As time went by, Leo continued to visit the bakery, helping Mrs. Lillian with the baking. The people in town noticed that the cakes remained just as delicious, even when Leo made them. They were happy to see that Mrs. Lillian had a helper. One day, Mrs. Lillian grew very tired. She had worked in the bakery for many years, and now it was time for her to rest. She called Leo to her side and said, "Leo, I am too old to run the bakery now. I want you to take over. You have learned everything I know, and you bake with love." Leo was surprised. "But I am not as good as you," he said. Mrs. Lillian smiled kindly. "You are just as good, Leo. You put your heart into every cake. And that's what makes them special. The bakery is yours now. Leo was sad to see Mrs. Lillian retire. But he knew it was time for him to carry on her legacy. He promised to continue baking. With love, just as she had taught him. From that day on, Leo ran the bakery. He made all the delicious cakes. The town loved, including the famous Moonlight Delight cake. The people of Silverbell still visited the bakery every day. They missed seeing Mrs. Lillian behind the counter. But they were happy that Leo had kept her traditions alive. The bakery remained as warm and inviting as ever. Years went by. And Leo became known as the best baker in town. But he never forgot who had taught him. Every time he baked a cake, he remembered Mrs. Lillian and her lessons about patience, kindness, and baking with love. One evening, as Leo was closing the bakery, a little girl walked in. She looked up at him and said, "I heard your cakes are the best in town. Can you teach me how to bake like you?" Leo smiled. Just as Mrs. Lillian had smiled at him many years ago. "Come back tomorrow morning. I'll teach you," he said. And so the story continued. The bakery was not just a place to buy cakes. It was a place where love and kindness were shared, passed down from one generation to the next.